Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she finished her third set of pull-ups at the Navy training facility in Coronado, California. The salty ocean breeze carried the sound of waves crashing against the shore, but all she could hear were the whispered comments from the group of Navy SEALs watching her from across the training yard. "She's gonna wash out in the first week," muttered Jake Thompson, a seasoned SEAL with arms covered in tattoos and scars from 3 tours overseas. His voice carried just enough for Sarah to hear, which was exactly his intention. Sarah had dreamed of joining the Navy's elite Special Operations Forces since she was 12 years old, watching documentaries about military heroes with her father, a retired Marine. At 25, she had already proven herself as one of the Navy's top intelligence analysts, speaking 4 languages fluently and holding a black belt in mixed martial arts. Her test scores were higher than most of the men in her class, and her physical fitness evaluations consistently ranked in the top 5%. But none of that seemed to matter to the SEALs who would become her teammates if she made it through the grueling selection process. To them, she was an experiment gone wrong, a political statement rather than a warrior. The Navy had recently opened combat roles to women, and Sarah was among the first to attempt the SEAL training program. The pressure was immense, not just from the physical demands of the training, but from the constant scrutiny and doubt from her male counterparts. Commander Rick Harrison, the training officer, called the group together for their morning briefing. His weathered face showed the wear of 20 years in special operations, and his reputation for breaking even the toughest recruits was legendary. Sarah stood at attention with the other candidates, feeling the weight of their stares like physical pressure on her shoulders. "Today we're running beach operations," Harrison announced, his voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. "Teams of 4 full-gear 12-mile course with obstacles. Last team back does night watch for the week." Sarah found herself paired with Thompson, along with 2 other SEALs named Marcus Williams and Tony Rodriguez. Thompson's expression made it clear he viewed her as dead weight, someone who would slow down his team and cost them the exercise. Marcus, a quiet but intense operator from Texas, seemed indifferent to her presence. Tony, the youngest of the group at 23, kept glancing at her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. The beach course was designed to push candidates beyond their limits. Carrying 60 pounds of gear, they had to navigate through surf, crawl under barbed wire, climb over wooden obstacles, and sprint across sand dunes that shifted with every step. Sarah had trained for this moment for 2 years, running hills, swimming in rough water, and building her endurance to levels she never thought possible. As they reached the first obstacle, a series of rope climbs over 20-foot walls, Thompson deliberately positioned himself to go first, setting a pace that was clearly meant to leave Sarah behind. She watched him scale the rope with practiced ease, his movements efficient and powerful. Marcus followed, then Tony, both moving with the fluid grace of experienced climbers. Sarah approached the rope, feeling the rough fibers against her palms. She had practiced this climb hundreds of times, but never with this much gear and never with 3 men watching her every move, waiting for her to fail. She began her ascent hand over hand, her legs wrapped around the rope for support. The weight of her pack pulled at her shoulders, and halfway up she felt her grip starting to slip. "Come on." "Liability," Thompson called from the top of the wall, using the nickname that had started circulating among the SEALs. "We don't have all day." Sarah gritted her teeth and continued climbing. The burns on her palms from the rope were getting worse, and her arms screamed in protest, but she refused to give up. She could hear her father's voice in her head, telling her that quitting was never an option. That true strength came from pushing through when everything inside you wanted to stop. She reached the top of the wall and looked down at the next obstacle, a 30-foot rappel into a mud pit filled with cold, dirty water. Thompson was already at the bottom, tapping his watch impatiently. Sarah secured her rappelling device and stepped off the edge, controlling her descent with steady, measured movements. The mud pit was worse than she had imagined. The water was freezing and the mud was thick enough to grab at her boots with every step. She waded through it as quickly as she could, feeling the cold seep through her uniform and into her bones. Behind her, she could hear Marcus and Tony moving through the water, their breathing heavy but controlled. The next part of the course took them across a series of sand dunes, where the soft sand made every step feel like running through quicksand. Sarah's legs burned with the effort, and she could feel sweat mixing with the mud on her face. Thompson maintained his punishing pace, never looking back to check on his teammates, his focus entirely on winning the exercise. As they crested the largest dune, Sarah saw the next challenge ahead. A crawl through a tunnel barely wide enough for a person, filled with more mud and stretching for nearly 50 yards. She watched Thompson disappear into the tunnel entrance, his movements quick and efficient even in the confined space. When her turn came, Sarah dropped to her belly and began the crawl. The tunnel was darker than she had expected and the mud was deeper here, forcing her to keep her head up to avoid getting mouthfuls of the thick, gritty mixture. Her pack caught on the tunnel wall several times, forcing her to wiggle and adjust her position to keep moving forward. Halfway through the tunnel, she heard Thompson's voice echoing back from the exit. "Move faster, Martinez. You're holding up the whole team." Sarah bit back her response and focused on her movement. Every inch forward was a struggle, but she kept going inch by inch until she finally saw daylight ahead. She emerged from the tunnel covered in mud from head to toe, her uniform soaked and heavy with the extra weight. The final obstacle was a quarter-mile sprint to the finish line, across loose sand that shifted with every step. Sarah's legs felt like they were made of lead, and her lungs burned with each breath. She could see Thompson ahead of her, still moving strong with Marcus and Tony somewhere behind her in the tunnel. She dug deep and found a reserve of energy she didn't know she had. Her pace increased and she began closing the gap between herself and Thompson. He looked back, surprised to see her gaining ground, and pushed himself harder. The finish line was just ahead, marked by a simple rope stretched between two poles. Thompson crossed first, followed closely by Sarah, with Marcus and Tony emerging from the tunnel and sprinting to catch up. The four of them collapsed near the finish line, breathing heavily and covered in mud and sweat. "Not bad for a liability," Thompson said, his voice carrying a grudging respect that hadn't been there before. Sarah looked at him through the mud covering her face and smiled. The day's not over yet. 3 weeks into SEAL training, Sarah had proven she could keep up with the physical demands, but the real test came during tactical exercises. The training facility buzzed with nervous energy as Commander Harrison announced they would be conducting live-fire urban warfare simulations. Teams would navigate through a mock city built specifically for training, complete with buildings, alleyways, and hidden threats. Sarah found herself assigned to a different team this time, working with veterans she hadn't trained with before. Staff Sergeant Mike Chen, a demolitions expert with 12 years of experience, served as team leader. Danny Foster, a sniper with a reputation for never missing his target, barely acknowledged her presence during the briefing. The fourth member was Luis Vasquez, a communications specialist who seemed more interested in his equipment than his teammates. The mock city stretched across 5 acres, with 2-story buildings, narrow alleys, and hidden passages designed to simulate urban combat scenarios. Each team carried paint-based ammunition that would mark hits without causing serious injury, but the psychological pressure was real. Instructors playing enemy combatants were positioned throughout the area, armed with similar weapons and orders to eliminate any team that made tactical errors. "Remember," Chen addressed his team before they entered the simulation area, "communication is everything. We move as a unit, watch each other's backs, and nobody takes unnecessary risks." His eyes lingered on Sarah when he said the last part, making his concerns about her experience level clear. Sarah checked her weapon and ammunition for the 3rd time, running through the tactical procedures she had studied for months. Urban warfare was different from open combat, requiring split-second decisions and perfect coordination between team members. One mistake could get the entire team eliminated from the exercise. They entered the mock city through a breach in the perimeter wall, moving in a diamond formation with Chen taking point and Sarah covering the rear. The silence was unsettling, broken only by the sound of their boots on concrete and the distant noise of other teams engaged in their own battles throughout the facility. The first building they encountered was a 3-story structure with multiple entry points. Chen signaled for the team to spread out, with Foster taking position to provide sniper cover while Sarah and Vasquez prepared to clear the building room by room. Through her headset, she could hear other teams reporting contact with enemy forces, their voices tense with adrenaline. Sarah followed Chen up a stairwell, her weapon ready and her senses heightened to every sound and shadow. The building's interior was designed to be confusing, with multiple hallways and rooms that could hide threats around every corner. As they reached the 2nd floor, she heard movement from a room at the end of the hallway. Chen held up his hand, signaling for silence, then pointed toward the room where they had heard the noise. Sarah nodded and moved to the opposite side of the doorway, preparing to enter on his signal. The seconds stretched like hours as they waited, listening for any indication of what might be waiting inside. When Chen gave the signal, they entered the room simultaneously, sweeping their weapons across different sectors to cover all angles. The room appeared empty, but Sarah noticed a slight movement behind an overturned table. She raised her weapon just as an instructor emerged from behind cover, his paint gun aimed directly at Chen. Without thinking, Sarah fired first, marking the instructor with bright orange paint before he could eliminate her team leader. The instructor called out his elimination over the radio, confirming the hit. Chen looked at Sarah with surprise and something that might have been respect. "Good eyes," he said quietly into his headset. "Stay sharp, there could be more." They continued through the building, clearing each room methodically. Sarah's heart pounded with adrenaline, but her training kept her movements precise and controlled. In the third room they entered, Vasquez triggered a booby trap that filled the air with harmless but disorienting smoke. Through the chaos, Sarah heard footsteps approaching from behind them. She spun around to see two more instructors moving through the smoke, their weapons ready to eliminate the confused team. Sarah dropped to one knee and fired rapidly, marking both targets before they could return fire. Her accuracy under pressure impressed even Foster, who had been watching through his scope from outside the building. "Two more down," Sarah reported through her headset. "Building secure." But their success in the first building was only the beginning. As they moved deeper into the mock city, the scenarios became more challenging. They encountered simulated civilians who needed to be protected, explosive devices that required careful handling, and enemy snipers positioned in windows and on rooftops. During one particularly intense encounter, their team found themselves pinned down by crossfire from two different buildings. Foster was trying to identify sniper positions, while Chen coordinated their movement through a narrow alley. Vasquez's radio equipment had been damaged during the firefight, cutting off their communication with headquarters. Sarah studied the tactical situation and noticed something the others had missed. The enemy positions were coordinated, but there was a blind spot between the buildings where someone could move undetected. It would require a dangerous sprint across open ground, but it could allow them to flank one of the sniper positions. "I can reach that building," she told Chen, pointing to the structure on their left. "If I can get inside and work my way up, I can take out at least one of their positions." Chen shook his head immediately. "Too risky. We'll wait for backup or find another way." But Sarah had already calculated the odds. Their current position was unsustainable, and backup was engaged with other scenarios throughout the facility. Every minute they waited increased the chances that more enemy forces would arrive to reinforce the positions holding them down. "Give me covering fire," she said, and before Chen could object, she was already moving. Sarah sprinted across the open ground, using abandoned vehicles and debris for cover. Paint rounds whizzed past her head as the enemy snipers tried to track her movement, but Foster's return fire kept them from getting a clear shot. She reached the building and found a side entrance that had been left unguarded. Inside, she moved quickly but quietly up the stairs, knowing that time was critical. Her teammates were still pinned down, and she could hear the intensity of the firefight increasing through her headset. The building's layout was similar to the others, but she noticed recent footprints in the dust leading toward the upper floors. On the third floor, she found what she was looking for. Two instructors had set up a sniper position overlooking the alley where her team was trapped. They were focused on their targets below and didn't notice her approach until it was too late. Sarah eliminated both of them with quick, accurate shots, then immediately moved to secure the position. "Sniper nest neutralized," she reported through her headset. "You're clear to move." Chen's voice came back with obvious relief. "Outstanding work, Martinez. Let's finish this thing." With one sniper position eliminated, Foster was able to focus his fire on the remaining enemy location, while Chen and Vasquez advanced through the alley. Sarah provided cover from her elevated position, watching for any additional threats that might emerge from the surrounding buildings. The exercise concluded with their team successfully reaching the objective and securing the area. As they gathered for debriefing, Sarah noticed the way her teammates looked at her had changed. The skepticism was still there, but it was mixed with something else now: recognition that she could perform under pressure. Chen approached her as they were cleaning their weapons. That was good thinking back there, he said. Most people would have waited for orders. Sometimes you can't wait, Sarah replied. Sometimes you have to trust your training and take action. Foster, who had barely spoken to her before the exercise, nodded in agreement. Your shooting was solid too. Clean hits under pressure. Even Vasquez, usually absorbed in his equipment, looked up from his radio long enough to say, "Thanks for watching our backs in there." As they walked back toward the debriefing room, Sarah overheard Thompson talking to another group of SEALs about the exercise. His tone was different now, less dismissive and more analytical. She might actually make it through, he was saying. Still think the whole thing's a mistake, but she's got skills. Sarah smiled to herself as she continued walking. She was beginning to understand that earning respect in this community wasn't about proving you belonged. It was about proving you could be trusted when everything went wrong. Today had been a good start, but she knew the real tests were still ahead. 6 months after completing SEAL training, Sarah received her first deployment assignment to a forward operating base in eastern Syria. The mission briefing took place in a secure room at the base, where she joined 12 other SEALs for what command described as a high-priority intelligence gathering operation. Among the familiar faces were Thompson, Chen, and Foster, along with several operators she had only heard about through reputation. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, a career special operations officer with silver hair and intense blue eyes, led the briefing. Maps and satellite images covered the walls, showing a compound approximately 40 kilometers from their current position. According to intelligence reports, the location housed a high-value target involved in coordinating attacks against Allied forces in the region. The target is Ahmad Hassan, a mid-level commander with connections throughout the regional network, Morrison explained, pointing to a photograph on the briefing board. He's been operating from this compound for the past 3 weeks, and our window for capture is closing rapidly. Sarah studied the aerial photographs of the compound, noting the defensive positions, entry points, and potential escape routes. The intelligence package indicated approximately 15 to 20 enemy combatants at the location, armed with automatic weapons and possibly explosive devices. The mission would require precision timing and flawless execution. Martinez, Morrison said, drawing her attention back to the briefing. Your language skills and intelligence background make you essential for this operation. You'll be responsible for interrogating any captured personnel and gathering actionable intelligence from documents or electronic devices we recover. Thompson shifted in his seat, his expression making it clear he disagreed with giving Sarah such a critical role on her first combat deployment. Several other team members exchanged glances, their concerns about her lack of field experience evident despite her performance during training. The operation was scheduled for the following night, taking advantage of new moon conditions that would provide maximum darkness for their approach. Sarah spent the day reviewing intelligence files, studying photographs of known associates, and preparing her interrogation materials. The weight of responsibility felt heavier than any training exercise she had completed. That evening, as the team prepared their equipment, Chen approached her at the weapons rack where she was checking her rifle for the 3rd time. His expression was serious but not unfriendly, the look of someone preparing to trust his life to a teammate he wasn't completely sure about. First time's always different, he said, adjusting the sights on his own weapon. Training prepares you for most of it, but there are things you can't simulate. The smell, the sounds, the way time seems to slow down when things get intense. Sarah nodded, appreciating his honesty. Any advice? Stick to your training, trust your teammates, and remember that everyone out there is depending on you to do your job. No pressure, he added with a slight smile. The helicopter insertion went smoothly, with their aircraft landing 2 kilometers from the target compound under cover of darkness. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as they disembarked and began their approach march through the rocky terrain. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, with loose stones that threatened to shift underfoot and sparse vegetation that provided little concealment. Moving in tactical formation, the team covered the distance to the compound in just under an hour. Sarah carried her standard combat load plus additional equipment for intelligence gathering, including electronic devices for copying computer hard drives and cameras for documenting any evidence they discovered. The compound consisted of 3 main buildings surrounded by a low stone wall with guard positions at 2 corners. Through night vision equipment, They could observe sentries moving between the buildings and identified at least 6 guards maintaining perimeter security. The main building showed signs of recent activity, with lights visible through covered windows and several vehicles parked nearby. Team leader Captain Rodriguez, a veteran of 4 previous deployments, positioned his operators around the compound perimeter and waited for confirmation that all elements were in position. Sarah found herself paired with Foster in overwatch position, responsible for providing sniper cover during the assault phase. Target building has movement on the 2nd floor, Foster reported through his headset, tracking figures through his scope. Count 3, possibly 4 individuals. Rodriguez confirmed the observation and gave the signal to begin the operation. The assault team moved simultaneously toward multiple entry points, using explosive charges to breach doors and windows. Sarah watched through her scope as the team flowed into the building like water, each operator moving with practiced efficiency toward predetermined objectives. The initial entry was successful, with minimal resistance from surprised guards. Sarah could hear the controlled chaos of the assault through her headset, with team members calling out room clearances and reporting captured personnel. Everything was proceeding according to plan until someone inside the building triggered an alarm. Suddenly, the compound erupted with activity. Additional enemy fighters emerged from concealed positions, and automatic weapons fire began pouring from windows throughout the complex. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from at least 8 different positions, far more resistance than intelligence estimates had predicted. "We've got a problem," Rodriguez's voice crackled through the radio. Intelligence was wrong about the numbers. "We're looking at 20+ hostiles and they were ready for us." Foster adjusted his position and began engaging targets, his rifle fire precise and devastating. Sarah watched through her scope as enemy fighters tried to maneuver against the assault team. But her role was intelligence gathering, not direct combat engagement. She felt helpless watching her teammates under fire, while she remained in overwatch position. The situation deteriorated rapidly when an explosion rocked the main building. Someone inside had detonated an improvised explosive device, and Sarah could see flames beginning to spread through the 1st floor. Smoke poured from shattered windows, and she could hear calls for medical assistance through her headset. "Chen's down," came Thompson's voice, tight with stress. "Need immediate medical evacuation." Sarah made a decision that would define her career. Despite her orders to remain in overwatch position, she slung her rifle and began moving toward the compound. Foster called after her, but she was already running across the open ground between her position and the building. Enemy fire tracked her movement as she sprinted toward the main entrance, bullets kicking up dust and stone fragments around her feet. She reached the building and dove through a window opening, landing hard on the floor inside. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of explosives, making it difficult to see more than a few feet in any direction. She found Chen in a hallway near the rear of the building, unconscious and bleeding from a head wound. Thompson was applying pressure to a leg wound while trying to coordinate the team's withdrawal over the radio. The building was becoming unstable, with structural damage from the explosion threatening to cause a collapse. "What are you doing here?" Thompson demanded when he saw her. "You're supposed to be in Overwatch." "Helping my teammate," Sarah replied, immediately beginning to assess Chen's injuries. Her medical training from SEAL school took over as she checked his pulse and breathing, determining that his wounds were serious but not immediately life-threatening. Working together, Sarah and Thompson managed to get Chen stabilized and began moving him toward an exit. The smoke was getting thicker, and Sarah could hear the sound of flames spreading through other parts of the building. They had minutes, maybe less, before the structure became completely unsafe. As they reached what remained of the main entrance, enemy fire forced them to take cover behind a collapsed wall. Sarah could see the extraction point where helicopters were supposed to land, but 50 meters of open ground lay between their position and safety. Enemy fighters had positioned themselves to cover that area, making movement extremely dangerous. "We can't stay here," Thompson said, checking his ammunition. "Building's going to come down and they've got us pinned." Sarah studied the tactical situation, looking for options they might have missed. The enemy positions were well coordinated, but she noticed they were focused primarily on the main entrance and the planned extraction point. There might be another way out. "There's a back exit through the kitchen area," she said, remembering the building layout from their pre-mission briefing. "If we can reach it, we can circle around and approach the landing zone from a different angle." Thompson looked skeptical, but the sound of groaning metal and cracking concrete from above made the decision for them. They had to move, and her suggestion was their best option. Supporting Chen between them, they began working their way through the smoke-filled building toward the rear exit. The kitchen area was partially collapsed, but Sarah found a gap large enough for them to squeeze through. They emerged into an alley behind the compound, temporarily safe from the enemy fire but still far from the extraction point. Chen was regaining consciousness but couldn't walk without assistance. Through her headset, Sarah could hear Rodriguez coordinating the team's withdrawal and calling for close air support to suppress enemy positions. The helicopters were inbound, but they needed someone to mark the landing zone and provide security during extraction. "This is Martinez," she reported over the radio. "I've got Chen Stable and Thompson with me at the rear of the compound. We can mark the LZ if you can suppress the enemy positions covering the primary extraction point." Rodriguez confirmed her transmission and coordinated with air support. Sarah used her remaining smoke grenades to mark their position and provide concealment as the team began converging on the new extraction point. The helicopters arrived with covering fire that drove the enemy fighters into defensive positions, allowing the team to reach safety. As they lifted off, Sarah looked down at the burning compound and realized that everything had changed. She was no longer a trainee or a liability. She was a Navy SEAL who had proven herself under fire, and her teammates now looked at her with the respect she had worked so hard to earn. After 18 months of successful deployments, Sarah returned to San Diego for what was supposed to be a routine leave period. She had earned her place among the elite SEALs through 3 combat tours, numerous successful missions, and the grudging respect of even her harshest critics. Her personnel file contained commendations for valor, expert marksmanship, and tactical innovation that had saved lives and completed objectives others thought impossible. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning while she was enjoying coffee at a beachside cafe near Coronado. Her former teammate Danny Foster was on the line, his voice tight with urgency and something that sounded like fear. "Sarah, I need to see you right away," he said without preamble. "There's something happening that you need to know about. Can you meet me at Murphy's Pub tonight at 8? Murphy's Pub was a dive bar frequented by off-duty military personnel, the kind of place where conversations could get loud and nobody paid attention to what anyone else was discussing. Sarah arrived early and chose a corner booth where she could watch the entrance and exit, a habit developed through years of security training. Foster arrived exactly on time, but he looked different than she remembered. His usual confident demeanor was replaced by nervous energy, and he kept glancing around the bar as if he expected to be followed. When he sat down across from her, Sarah noticed his hands were shaking slightly. "What's going on, Danny?" she asked, keeping her voice low. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Foster ordered a beer and waited until the bartender was out of earshot before speaking. "It's about Thompson and some of the other guys from our old unit. They've been talking, Sarah, talking about you, about what happened during that last deployment." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Their last deployment together had been to Afghanistan, where their team had been assigned to capture a high-value target suspected of coordinating attacks against coalition forces. The mission had been successful, but the intelligence they gathered had revealed corruption within their own command structure. "What kind of talking?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "They're saying you went rogue during the mission, that you compromised operational security by pursuing unauthorized intelligence targets. Thompson's been meeting with investigators from Naval Criminal Investigative Service, and he's painting a picture that makes you look like you were working your own agenda." Sarah's mind raced back to that mission. They had been assigned to capture Ahmad Nazir, a Taliban commander operating from a compound near Kandahar. During the assault, Sarah had discovered evidence that American weapons were being supplied to insurgent forces through a corruption network that included officers from their own chain of command. Instead of ignoring the evidence as Thompson had suggested, Sarah had documented everything and reported it through proper channels when they returned to base. The investigation that followed had resulted in courts-martial for 3 officers and a major scandal that embarrassed the Pentagon. Sarah had testified truthfully about what she had discovered, believing she was doing her duty as a soldier and an American. "He's claiming I went beyond mission parameters," Sarah said, understanding the implications immediately. "That I compromised the team by pursuing intelligence that wasn't part of our assigned objectives." Foster nodded grimly. "That's exactly what he's saying, and he's got Williams and Rodriguez backing him up." They're all telling the same story about how you put personal glory ahead of team safety. Sarah felt anger building in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had always known that exposing the corruption network would make enemies, but she had never imagined that her own teammates would turn against her. The evidence she had gathered had been clear and undeniable, leading to convictions and the disruption of a weapons trafficking operation that was killing American soldiers. "What about the evidence?" she asked. "The weapon serial numbers, the documentation I recovered from the compound? None of that was fabricated." "They're not disputing the evidence," Foster explained. "They're questioning your methods and your authority to gather it. Thompson's claiming you acted independently, without team coordination, and that your actions put everyone at risk." Sarah remembered the mission clearly. While the rest of the team had been securing the primary target, she had noticed unusual markings on weapons stored in an adjacent building. Following her training and instincts, she had investigated and discovered crates of American-made rifles and ammunition that should never have been in enemy hands. The serial numbers and shipping manifest she had photographed had ultimately traced back to a supply officer who was selling weapons to local dealers, who were then selling them to insurgent forces. Her evidence had broken open a case that investigators had been pursuing for months without success. "So what's the real story here?" Sarah asked. "Why are they coming after me now, months after the investigation closed?" Foster looked around the bar again before answering. "Word is that some high-ranking officers who were embarrassed by the scandal are looking for payback. They can't go after you directly for exposing corruption, but they can question your methods and your fitness for special operations." The picture was becoming clearer. Sarah had made powerful enemies by doing the right thing, and now those enemies were using her former teammates to destroy her career. Thompson and the others were either being pressured or incentivized to provide testimony that would question her judgment and reliability. "There's something else," Foster continued. "I heard through unofficial channels that they're planning to recommend you for reassignment out of special operations. They want to send you to a desk job where you can't cause any more embarrassment to people with stars on their shoulders." Sarah felt the floor drop out from under her. Special operations wasn't just her job, it was her identity. She had worked harder than anyone else to earn her place among the SEALs, proving herself through training that broke stronger people in missions that would have defeated less determined operators. "What evidence do they have besides Thompson's testimony?" she asked. "That's the problem," Foster said. "In special operations, teammate testimony carries enormous weight. If Thompson, Williams, and Rodriguez all say you went rogue, it becomes very difficult to prove otherwise. Mission reports can be interpreted different ways, but when your own team says you compromised their safety, that's hard to overcome." Sarah thought about the men she had served with, shared dangers with, and trusted with her life. Thompson had never fully accepted her presence in the unit, but she had thought their shared combat experiences had earned his professional respect. Williams had seemed supportive, and Rodriguez had recommended her for a commendation after the Syria mission. "Why are they doing this?" she asked. "We served together. We saved each other's lives." Foster's expression was sympathetic but grim. "Some people think loyalty means protecting the system, even when the system is wrong. Thompson believes the military is stronger when people follow orders and don't ask uncomfortable questions. Your investigation embarrassed people he respects, and he sees that as a betrayal of the Brotherhood." The conversation continued for another hour, with Foster providing details about the investigation and the testimony being gathered against her. Sarah learned that the hearing was scheduled for the following month, and that her career and reputation hung in the balance. As they prepared to leave, Foster grabbed her arm. "Sarah, there's one more thing. Be careful who you trust going forward. This goes deeper than just Thompson and his friends. People are watching you, and they're looking for any excuse to finish what they started." Walking back to her car in the parking lot, Sarah felt the weight of betrayal settling on her shoulders. She had always believed that doing the right thing would be enough, that truth and integrity would protect her from those who wanted to silence inconvenient voices. Now she was learning that sometimes the system punished those who exposed its failures. But Sarah Martinez had not survived SEAL training and multiple combat deployments by giving up when things got difficult. If Thompson and his allies wanted a fight, she would give them one. She had evidence of her own, witnesses who could testify to the truth, and a determination that had never failed her before. The battle for her career was just beginning, and Sarah intended to win it. But first she needed to understand exactly who she was fighting and what weapons they were planning to use against her. The investigation into her conduct was only the opening move in a larger game, and she needed to learn the rules quickly if she wanted to survive. That night, Sarah sat at her kitchen table with a legal pad and began making lists, names of people who could testify on her behalf, documentation of her service record, and evidence that would prove her actions during the Afghanistan mission had been appropriate and necessary. If they wanted to destroy her reputation, they would have to get past the truth first. The next morning, she made an appointment with a military attorney and began preparing her defense. The Navy SEALs had called her a liability, but they were about to learn that underestimating Sarah Martinez was a mistake they would regret. Sarah spent the next 3 weeks building her defense with the intensity she had once applied to mission planning. Her military attorney, Major Lisa Harrison, was a former prosecutor with 15 years of experience defending service members against charges ranging from insubordination to treason. Harrison's reputation for thorough preparation and aggressive cross-examination made her the perfect advocate for Sarah's case. The key to winning this, Harrison explained during their first strategy session, is proving that your actions were not only justified but necessary. We need to show that any reasonable operator in your position would have done exactly what you did. They worked together to reconstruct the timeline of the Afghanistan mission, gathering statements from intelligence analysts who had reviewed Sarah's findings, explosive ordnance disposal technicians who had examined the weapons cache, and investigators who had followed up on her leads. The evidence painted a clear picture of professional competence and appropriate initiative. Sarah also reached out to Chen, who had recovered fully from his injuries and was now stationed at Special Operations Command in Tampa. His perspective on her combat performance and decision-making would be crucial to countering Thompson's claims about her reliability under pressure. "I've been following what's happening," Chen told her during a secure phone call. "Thompson's been making calls trying to get people to support his version of events, but there are plenty of us who remember how you performed when things got bad. You saved my life in Syria, and you've earned the right to have your story told." The hearing was scheduled to take place at Naval Base San Diego, in a conference room that felt more like a courtroom with its formal setup and intimidating atmosphere. Sarah arrived in her dress blue uniform, her ribbons and insignia telling the story of her service more eloquently than any testimony could. The panel consisted of 3 officers: Captain Robert Stevens, a career SEAL with 22 years of service; Commander Jennifer Walsh, a Navy intelligence officer who had never served in special operations; and Lieutenant Colonel Michael Torres, a Marine officer serving as the neutral representative. Thompson was the first witness called to testify. He entered the room in his dress uniform, his bearing confident and his manner respectful but firm. Sarah watched as he took the oath and prepared to deliver testimony that could end her career. Chief Petty Officer Thompson, the investigating officer, began, "Please describe your professional relationship with Petty Officer Martinez and your observations of her conduct during the Afghanistan mission." Thompson's testimony was devastating in its calm professionalism. He described Sarah as a competent operator who had demonstrated concerning tendencies toward independent action that compromised team cohesion and mission security. His account of the Afghanistan mission portrayed her intelligence gathering as an unauthorized deviation from assigned objectives that had put the entire team at risk. Petty Officer Martinez chose to pursue her own investigative agenda rather than maintaining focus on our primary mission, Thompson stated. While her discoveries ultimately proved significant, her methods demonstrated a concerning disregard for chain of command and team coordination protocols. Williams and Rodriguez followed with similar testimony, each describing incidents where Sarah's actions had supposedly demonstrated poor judgment or inappropriate independence. Their accounts were consistent and damaging, painting a picture of an operator who couldn't be trusted to follow orders or prioritize team safety. Sarah listened to her former teammates' testimony with growing anger, not just at their betrayal, but at their willingness to twist the truth to serve their own purposes. These were men she had trusted with her life, who had seen her perform under fire and knew firsthand her dedication to the mission and her teammates. When Major Harrison began her cross-examination of Thompson, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Her questions were precise and relentless, exposing inconsistencies in his testimony and challenging his interpretation of events. Chief Thompson, you testified that Petty Officer Martinez's actions put the team at risk. Can you identify any specific instance where a team member was injured or endangered as a direct result of her intelligence-gathering activities? Thompson hesitated before answering. The risk was in the deviation from mission parameters, not necessarily an immediate physical danger. So no team member was actually harmed by her actions? Not directly, no, Harrison continued, pressing, forcing Thompson to admit that Sarah's discoveries had led to the disruption of a weapons trafficking network that had been responsible for attacks against American forces. She also got him to acknowledge that the intelligence Sarah had gathered had been praised by higher command and had resulted in significant operational successes. So, while you criticize Petty Officer Martinez's methods, you acknowledge that her results saved American lives? Thompson's answer was reluctant but honest. The intelligence was valuable, yes. When Sarah's turn came to testify, she felt the weight of her career hanging in the balance. She had prepared extensively, but she knew that her words and demeanor in the next hour would determine whether she continued serving as a Navy SEAL or found herself reassigned to a desk job. Petty Officer Martinez, the investigating officer, began, please describe your decision-making process during the Afghanistan mission when you chose to investigate the weapons cache. Sarah's voice was steady and confident as she began her testimony. Sir, during the assault phase of the mission, I observed unusual markings on weapons in an adjacent building. Based on my intelligence training and my understanding of the threat environment, I made the tactical decision to investigate these weapons while maintaining communication with my team leader. She went on to describe her thought process, explaining how her background in intelligence analysis had enabled her to recognize the significance of American weapons in enemy hands. Her account was detailed and professional, demonstrating clear reasoning and appropriate adherence to protocols. At no point did I act independently of team coordination, she emphasized. I maintained radio contact, reported my findings immediately, and rejoined the team as soon as my investigation was complete. The intelligence I gathered was within the scope of our mission to disrupt enemy operations. Major Harrison then called character witnesses who painted a very different picture of Sarah's service than the one Thompson had presented. Chen testified about her tactical competence and life-saving actions during combat operations. Her former commanding officer described her as one of the most reliable and capable operators he had supervised. Foster, despite the risk to his own career, provided testimony that contradicted some of Thompson's claims about team dynamics and Sarah's reliability. His insider perspective on the unit's operations carried significant weight with the panel. The most powerful testimony came from Colonel Patricia Morrison, the officer who had overseen the investigation into the weapons trafficking network. Morrison testified that Sarah's intelligence gathering had been not only appropriate but exceptional, leading to arrests and convictions that had disrupted a major threat to coalition forces. Petty Officer Martinez demonstrated exactly the kind of initiative and analytical thinking we need from our special operations personnel, Morrison stated. Her actions were consistent with her training, her authority, and her duty as a Navy SEAL. During closing arguments, Major Harrison systematically dismantled the case against Sarah, demonstrating that her actions had been professional, appropriate, and highly effective. She argued that the real issue was not Sarah's conduct but the discomfort some people felt about being exposed for their failures. This hearing is not really about Petty Officer Martinez's performance, Harrison declared. It's about whether we punish people for doing their jobs too well, for asking uncomfortable questions, and for exposing problems that some would prefer to keep hidden. The panel deliberated for 3 hours before reaching their decision. Captain Stevens delivered the verdict with a grave expression that made Sarah's heart race with anticipation. After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence, this panel finds that Petty Officer Martinez's actions during the Afghanistan mission were appropriate, professional, and within the scope of her duties and authority. The charges of inappropriate independent action and compromising team safety are not supported by the evidence. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her, but Stevens wasn't finished. However, this panel notes that there appear to be significant issues with unit cohesion and communication that contributed to this incident. We recommend that all parties involved receive additional training in team coordination, and that unit leadership address the underlying conflicts that led to these charges being filed. As the hearing concluded, Sarah realized she had won more than just her career. She had proven that integrity and truth could prevail against political pressure and personal vendettas, but she also understood that her victory had come at a cost, and that her relationships with some of her former teammates might never recover. Walking out of the hearing room, Sarah felt both vindicated and isolated. She had kept her place among the Navy SEALs, but she knew that the real battle was just beginning. Thompson and his allies might have lost this round, but they wouldn't give up easily. If she was going to continue serving, she would need to be ready for whatever came next. Major Harrison walked with her toward the parking lot, her expression satisfied but cautious. "You won today, but be careful going forward. People like Thompson don't forget and they don't forgive. Watch your back and document everything." Sarah nodded, understanding the warning. She had learned that even among the elite forces she had worked so hard to join, politics and personal agendas could be more dangerous than any enemy she might face in combat. But she had also learned that she was tougher than her enemies had anticipated, and that was knowledge she intended to use. 3 months after the hearing, Sarah returned from a successful mission in Somalia to find her world turned upside down once again. The victory at the disciplinary hearing had seemed like the end of her troubles, but it had actually been just the beginning of a more sophisticated campaign to destroy her career. The trouble started when Sarah received orders reassigning her from active SEAL operations to a training position at the Naval Special Warfare Development Group. On paper, the assignment looked like a promotion, with increased responsibility for developing new tactical procedures and training protocols. In reality, it was a carefully disguised way to remove her from operational missions while maintaining the appearance of career advancement. Captain Stevens, who had served on her hearing panel, called her into his office to deliver the news personally. His expression was sympathetic but firm, suggesting that the decision had come from levels far above his authority to influence. "Sarah, I want you to understand that this reassignment isn't a reflection of your performance or capabilities," Stevens explained. "You're being asked to take on a critical role in developing the next generation of SEAL operators. It's important work that requires someone with your experience and tactical knowledge." Sarah wasn't fooled by the diplomatic language. "Sir, with respect, how does removing me from active operations help develop the next generation? My most valuable experience comes from current missions, not from sitting behind a desk writing training manuals." Stevens sighed, his professional facade slipping slightly. "There are people in the Pentagon who believe your continued presence in operational units creates complications. The weapons trafficking investigation generated a lot of attention from congressional oversight committees, and some officers feel that your involvement in future operations might attract unwanted scrutiny." The truth was finally coming out. Sarah's success in exposing corruption had made her politically radioactive. Even though she had been vindicated at the hearing, her reputation as someone willing to challenge authority and ask difficult questions made commanders nervous about including her in sensitive missions. "So I'm being punished for doing my job correctly?" Sarah asked, making no effort to hide her frustration. "You're being assigned where your skills can be most effectively utilized," Stevens replied, but his tone suggested he didn't entirely believe his own words. That evening, Sarah met Foster at a different bar, one farther from the base where they were less likely to encounter other military personnel. Foster's contacts in the intelligence community had provided him with information about the forces working behind the scenes to derail Sarah's career. "It goes all the way to the top," Foster explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "Some of the officers who were embarrassed by the weapons trafficking scandal have friends in very high places. They can't touch you directly, but they can make sure you never get another operational assignment." Sarah felt the familiar anger building in her chest, but this time it was tempered by a cold determination. If they wanted to play political games, she would learn the rules and beat them at their own game. But first, she needed to understand exactly who she was fighting and what resources they had at their disposal. Over the following weeks, Sarah began her own investigation into the network of officers and officials who were working to end her career. Using her intelligence training and contacts throughout the special operations community, she began mapping the connections between the officers she had exposed and the people who were now targeting her. What she discovered was more extensive than she had imagined. The weapons trafficking scandal had been part of a larger pattern of corruption that included contract fraud, equipment theft, and deliberate misallocation of resources. The officers she had exposed were connected to a network that reached into defense contracting companies, congressional staff members, and senior Pentagon officials. The assignment to the training position was just the first step in a plan to gradually move her away from any position where she might uncover additional evidence of wrongdoing. Once she was safely contained in a staff role, they could begin the process of questioning her psychological fitness for special operations, leading to a medical discharge that would end her career while protecting their own interests. Sarah realized she was facing an enemy more dangerous than any terrorist organization or foreign military force. These were people who understood the system intimately and had the power to manipulate it to serve their purposes. They could destroy careers with a few phone calls and ruin reputations with carefully planted rumors. But Sarah had advantages they might not have anticipated. Her training as a SEAL had taught her to think tactically and to identify weaknesses in enemy positions. Her intelligence background had given her skills in research and analysis that were perfectly suited to investigating complex networks of corruption. Most importantly, her combat experience had taught her that sometimes the best defense was a devastating offense. She began documenting everything she could find about the corruption network, building files on key individuals and mapping their relationships and vulnerabilities. She identified officers who might be willing to testify about what they had witnessed, contractors who had been approached about fraudulent schemes, and officials who had raised concerns that were subsequently ignored. Foster provided technical assistance, using his connections to access databases and communication records that revealed the scope of the conspiracy. Chen contributed his own observations about suspicious activities he had witnessed during various deployments. Even some of Sarah's former critics began providing information when they realized how extensive the corruption had become. The breakthrough came when Sarah discovered that Thompson had been receiving payments from one of the defense contractors involved in the weapons trafficking scheme. Financial records showed regular deposits to an account Thompson had established for his wife, supposedly for a consulting business that appeared to exist only on paper. The payments had begun shortly after Thompson's return from the Afghanistan deployment where Sarah had discovered the weapons cache. The timing suggested that Thompson's testimony against Sarah had been motivated not just by personal animosity but by a desire to protect his financial relationship with the contractors she had exposed. Sarah also uncovered evidence that Williams and Rodriguez had been promised lucrative post-military employment with companies connected to the corruption network, explaining their willingness to provide testimony supporting Thompson's claims. The entire case against her had been orchestrated by people with financial stakes in covering up the truth. Armed with this evidence, Sarah faced a critical decision. She could use the information to protect herself, negotiating a deal that would allow her to continue her military career in exchange for keeping quiet about what she had discovered, or she could take the more dangerous path of exposing the entire network, knowing that doing so would make even more powerful enemies. The decision was made easier when Foster brought her additional intelligence about the scope of the corruption. The network wasn't just stealing money and equipment. Their activities were directly contributing to American casualties by providing substandard equipment and compromising operational security. "They're getting people killed," Foster told her during one of their clandestine meetings. "The equipment failures we've been seeing, the intelligence leaks that have compromised missions, it's all connected to this network. They're putting profits ahead of the lives of the people they're supposed to be supporting." Sarah knew what she had to do. She couldn't protect her own career while allowing corruption to continue that was costing American lives. Her oath as a service member and her personal code of honor demanded that she take action, regardless of the personal consequences. She began reaching out to journalists and congressional investigators who had the resources and authority to pursue the story beyond what military channels could accomplish. Sarah provided them with carefully selected evidence that would generate public attention and force official investigations that couldn't be suppressed or diverted. The first article appeared in the Washington Post 3 weeks later, with a headline that sent shockwaves through the Pentagon. "Navy SEAL exposes massive corruption network in Special Operations Command." The story detailed the weapons trafficking scheme, the attempts to silence Sarah, and the evidence of ongoing fraud and cover-ups. Within hours of the article's publication, Sarah received a phone call from Captain Stevens informing her that her training assignment had been suspended, pending a new investigation into her conduct. The message was clear. By going public, she had declared war on forces that had the power to destroy her completely. But Sarah had learned something important during her years as a Navy SEAL. Sometimes the only way to survive was to fight, even when the odds seemed impossible. She had taken the first shot in a battle that would determine not just her own future, but whether corruption and cover-ups would be allowed to continue endangering the lives of American service members. The war was far from over, but Sarah Martinez was ready to fight it with everything she had. She had been called a liability by the Navy SEALs, but she was about to prove that sometimes being a liability to the wrong people was exactly what the situation required. The congressional hearing room was packed with reporters, congressional staff, and Pentagon officials when Sarah walked in to testify before the House Armed Services Committee. 6 months had passed since the Washington Post article that had exposed the corruption network, and the investigation had grown far beyond what anyone had initially imagined. Sarah wore her dress blue uniform, with the full array of ribbons and decorations she had earned during her service. The Silver Star she had received for her actions in Syria caught the light as she raised her right hand to take the oath. Around the room she could see faces both friendly and hostile, people whose careers would be affected by what she was about to reveal. Congressman Michael Bradley, the committee chairman, had been a Marine officer before entering politics, and his understanding of military culture was evident in how he conducted the hearing. His opening statement made it clear that the committee took the allegations seriously and was prepared to follow the evidence wherever it led. Petty Officer Martinez, Bradley began, you have served your country with distinction in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. Today you're here to help us understand how that same courage led you to uncover what appears to be systematic corruption. Within our special operations forces, Sarah's testimony began with her discovery of the weapons cache in Afghanistan and continued through the attempts to destroy her career for exposing the truth. She spoke calmly and professionally, but her words carried the weight of someone who had risked everything to protect her fellow service members. The corruption I uncovered wasn't just about money, Sarah explained to the committee. It was about people in positions of trust betraying that trust for personal gain, while American soldiers paid the price with their lives. When I found those weapons, I knew I had a choice: look the other way and protect my own career, or do what I swore to do when I took my oath to defend this country. The evidence Sarah and her allies had gathered over the previous months painted a devastating picture of corruption that reached far beyond the initial weapons trafficking scheme. The committee heard testimony about fraudulent contracts worth millions of dollars, deliberately defective equipment that had failed during combat operations, and a systematic cover-up that had protected the perpetrators while targeting those who tried to expose them. Thompson appeared before the committee as a hostile witness, his earlier confidence replaced by the nervous demeanor of someone facing federal charges. The financial records Sarah had uncovered showed that he had received over $200,000 from defense contractors over a 3-year period, money that was clearly linked to his efforts to protect their interests. Under aggressive questioning from committee members, Thompson's story fell apart completely. He admitted to receiving payments but claimed they were for legitimate consulting services he couldn't adequately describe. When pressed about his testimony against Sarah, he became evasive and contradictory, making it obvious that his claims about her conduct had been motivated by financial considerations rather than legitimate concerns. You testified under oath that Petty Officer Martinez compromised team safety, Congressman Bradley stated, but the evidence shows that your own financial relationship with the very people she was investigating compromised your objectivity. How do you explain this contradiction? Thompson's answer was barely audible. I may have made some errors in judgment. Williams and Rodriguez faced similar questioning, and their testimony revealed the full scope of the pressure campaign that had been organized against Sarah. Both men admitted they had been approached by representatives of the corruption network and offered lucrative post-military employment. In exchange for supporting Thompson's version of events, the most damaging testimony came from Colonel Morrison, who had been investigating the corruption network independently and had been threatened with career-ending retaliation if she continued her work. Her evidence showed that the conspiracy included active cover-ups of equipment, failures that had directly contributed to American casualties. We estimate that at least 12 American service members died as a direct result of equipment failures caused by this fraud, Morrison testified. The people responsible for this conspiracy didn't just steal money from the American taxpayers, they stole the lives of American heroes. As the hearing continued, Sarah watched the faces of the congressional committee members and realized that the tide had turned decisively in favor of the truth. The evidence was too overwhelming and too well documented for anyone to dismiss or cover up. The corruption network that had seemed so powerful and untouchable was finally being exposed to the light of public scrutiny. The hearing's most dramatic moment came when Sarah was asked about the personal cost of her decision to expose the corruption. Her voice remained steady, but those who knew her could see the emotion beneath her professional composure. "I've been called a liability by some of the people I served with," Sarah said. "They said I couldn't be trusted to follow orders and that I put my own agenda ahead of the team. But I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, not to protect the careers of corrupt officers or the profits of fraudulent contractors." She paused, looking directly at the committee members before continuing. The real liability would have been staying silent while American service members continued to die because of equipment, failures and security breaches caused by people who put personal profit ahead of national security. The congressional investigation led to one of the largest corruption prosecutions in military history. Over 30 officers and civilian officials were ultimately charged with crimes ranging from fraud to conspiracy. Thompson received a sentence of 12 years in federal prison, while Williams and Rodriguez were court-martialed and dismissed from the service. The defense contractors involved in the scheme faced massive fines and criminal charges, with several executives receiving prison sentences. The investigation also led to reforms in procurement procedures and oversight mechanisms designed to prevent similar corruption in the future. For Sarah, vindication came in multiple forms. She was restored to active operational status and promoted to Senior Chief Petty Officer, with a new assignment to an elite counterterrorism unit. More importantly, she received formal recognition from the Secretary of Defense for her courage in exposing corruption that had endangered American lives. The ceremony took place at the Pentagon, with many of the same officials who had once worked to destroy her career, now praising her integrity and dedication. Sarah understood the irony of the situation, but she also recognized that institutional change often required exactly this kind of public pressure and accountability. Foster, Chen, and other allies who had supported her throughout the ordeal were also recognized for their roles in exposing the corruption. Their willingness to risk their own careers to support the truth had been essential to achieving justice. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from the families of service members who had been killed by defective equipment supplied through the fraudulent contracts. Their letters and messages to Sarah made it clear that her actions had prevented additional deaths and had brought accountability to those responsible for their loved ones' deaths. 6 months after the congressional hearing, Sarah found herself back in the field, leading a team of Navy SEALs on a counterterrorism mission in East Africa. The men and women under her command looked at her with the respect reserved for leaders who had proven themselves under the most extreme pressure. As she prepared for the mission briefing, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. She had been called a liability by people who saw her willingness to challenge authority as a threat to their comfortable corruption. Instead, she had proven that sometimes being a liability to the wrong people was exactly what the country needed. The mission ahead would be dangerous, but Sarah approached it with the confidence that came from knowing she had already faced the most challenging enemy of all, the temptation to remain silent in the face of wrongdoing. She had chosen truth over comfort, justice over career advancement, and the lives of her fellow service members over the profits of corrupt officials. Standing before her team as they prepared to deploy, Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Martinez embodied everything the Navy SEALs were supposed to represent: courage, integrity, and an uncompromising commitment to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. She had been tested by fire and had emerged stronger, ready to lead others who shared her dedication to serving something greater than themselves. The bar had indeed become a battlefield, but Sarah had not just survived the fight, she had won it completely, transforming from a perceived liability into a proven leader, whose example would inspire future generations of service members to choose courage over convenience, truth over comfort, and justice over personal gain.